Buenos días a todos. Para mí es un gran honor dar, primero que nada, una bienvenida protocolaria al doctor honoris causa por la Universidad Politécnica de Madrid, Lord Foster. Y lo he hecho muy protocolariamente para explicar que un arquitecto puede llegar a hacerlo todo, a ser todo, a haber construido todo, a haber intervenido en todas partes. Cuando en el año 92 yo volví a través de Nîmes, me metía dentro del Carré d'Art, que estaba recién construido, prácticamente terminándose, y me emocionaba cómo podía la arquitectura romana y la arquitectura contemporánea lidiar también una con otra. Nos enamorábamos del edificio de Hong Kong, nos enamorábamos y cómo la arquitectura podía reconstruir el Reichstag y volver a dar la imagen de la unidad alemana. Y siempre una arquitectura interviniendo en sitios históricos, en sitios de patrimonio, como es ahora el Museo del Prado, pero una arquitectura rabiosamente moderna, rabiosamente contemporánea, que nos hacía entender perfectamente que el patrimonio histórico es muy importante preservarlo, pero que hay que seguir construyéndolo, y que los monumentos de las próximas generaciones estarán hechos por esta. Para mí es un honor estar hoy aquí y además con un motivo maravilloso. Luis Fernández-Galiano, nuestro querido Luis Fernández-Galiano, ha comisariado una exposición espectacular en Telefónica, porque es una exposición de diálogo. Foster dialogando con Foster. El Foster de los años 60 hablando con el Foster de los años 2000, del segundo milenio. Dos Fosters en 2 milenios que uno habla con el otro y uno le cuenta al otro cómo hacía un cockpit, cómo hacía una especie de refugio junto a un río con forma de un avión y a continuación cómo se mete uno en la luna y se pone a hacer exploraciones lunares o marcianas. Un Foster pensando en el futuro. Una exposición que se llama Futuros Comunes y que realmente es un emblema para lo que va a pasar. Futuros comunes con todos nosotros, porque Norman Foster se ha instalado en nuestra ciudad. El Fórum, creado en el Teatro Real, trajo absolutamente a todo el mundo a hablar de las ciudades. A mí hace unos años, con motivo de una exposición de Campo Baeza en Estambul, me pusieron una alcachofa como esta y me preguntaron que cuál era la tipología que más me interesaba de arquitectura. Y contesté sin pensarlo la ciudad, porque es la que tiene más estratos que se superponen en el tiempo y en el espacio. Así que me da la impresión de que aquel que lo ha diseñado ya todo y no puede diseñar nada más importante, se ha establecido un nuevo reto. Y ese nuevo reto es diseñarnos a todos nosotros, diseñar la ciudad y diseñar nuestro futuro. Su contribución, su devolución a la comunidad, como Luis decía maravillosamente ayer, es eso, ayudarnos a pensar muy generosamente, montar una gran fundación que no es solamente el archivo de la memoria de su trabajo, sino que es un proyecto de futuro para que pensemos y reflexionemos en la ciudad. Cómo vamos a intervenir y cómo vamos a intervenir desde la propia arquitectura. Le agradezco muchísimo que se haya establecido aquí. Le agradezco muchísimo a Elena que sepa gestionar también toda esa operación. No es la mujer detrás del hombre, es la mujer al lado del hombre y que tiene claro que no es solo la custodia de la memoria, sino que es la gestora de la cultura y la gestora de la ciudad. Y creo que esta combinación imbatible de los dos va a darle mucho a esta ciudad y va a darle mucho a Madrid. Les animo a todos a ver la exposición, a no perdérsela, es de esas cosas que no pueden no verse, y les animo a aprender de él, aprender que hay que dibujar maravillosamente y que hay que dibujar la arquitectura vernácula, que hay que proyectar, que hay que saber construir y que los mayores alardes de la técnica pueden ser elementos tan claros como un proyecto en La Gomera o como una gran ciudad en Masdar en estos momentos. Gracias, Luis, por traer a Norman Foster a la escuela una vez más y muchas gracias por tu contribución continua a que esta escuela siga siendo una de las mejores del mundo. Gracias por estar aquí.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a kind of ritual to say that I'm pleased to be here, but genuinely, it gives me great pleasure to return to this school. So I was saying how much pleasure it gives me to be here and how impressed I am by the work, by the students, and by the ambience of the school. Luis asked me to give a kind of repeat of the talk that I gave on cities at the event on the 1st of June of the Foundation in the Royal Theatre. But I have a problem. I've never in my life ever given the same talk twice. So that poses something of a problem. But Luis came to the rescue because in the exhibition that he curated, I started to see things through that exhibition as it emerged, which made me realize connections which I hadn't seen before. So I've kind of woven those into the talk that I gave on the 1st of June. So it's a kind of variation. And the theme was about cities globally. They are the future. More people live in cities. More people are flooding into cities. By 2050, 70% of the globe will be urban, with another 2.4 billion in the population. The bad news is that cities are responsible for 70% of global energy and the emissions that follow from that. The good news is that they generate wealth, they generate opportunity, education, liberation. For example, New York City, in terms of its wealth, GDP, is the equivalent of 4 Switzerlands. It's almost one Mexico as a country. Those cities of the future, 1 in 3 will be informal settlements, which is a very polite way of saying that they don't have running water, access to power, or sanitation as we know it. The new cities could be 100 million. And it is not just the scale that is new, but perhaps the rate of urbanization. In those 3 cities, you have 1 new person every 30 seconds. How do we put a city like Madrid into that more global context? I mean, for me, for reasons that I'll explain later, Madrid is a kind of model European, sustainable, pedestrian-friendly city, highly sustainable. And if you look at this image, sometimes I think you have to repeat the obvious. You look at this image, it's about a street, but that street is defined by buildings, the architecture. But the totality of that infrastructure, of the routes, and the infrastructure could be the parks, the squares, the gateways, the bridges, the public transport, that combination of infrastructure and buildings globally is responsible for 75% of the energy consumed, and therefore, at the moment, the pollution which is generated. And so that puts simply the buildings and the movement of people and goods between those buildings. If we put the rate of urbanization into a European context, we're right in the middle of an explosion of urbanization just in China. That's the equivalent of 1 Madrid every 2 months for 6 years. Just to put it into that context. And the pollution that follows from that, if you take a kind of foggy, smoggy day in Beijing, that is the equivalent of smoking 1 pack of cigarettes in terms of the health impact. Sometimes I show a very similar image, and it's got 1952 London, and it claimed 12,000 lives. And that was cleared up by the political act of the Clean Air Act of 1956. At that point in time, a small island didn't impact the global entity. But the scale of pollution now is such that that is, in a shared world, affects everybody. It's not just a national, local, it is a total global in terms of its impact. And if we look at the top of that and we look at the kind of frozen waste, the polar areas, as those melt, the kind of polar bear sitting on top of that melting mass of ice seems really far away. It's not going to bother us, or is it? Because if you consider that 75% of the world's cities are on a coastline and 50% of the world population is within 100 kilometers of the coast, then really it is a catastrophe, because as we can start to see since June the 1st, when I showed extraordinary images of hurricanes, since then Irma has come along and a greater magnitude, wiping out infrastructure, buildings at an extraordinary level. So if that is a consequence of greenhouse gas emissions, what are the prime generators of those emissions, and what can we collectively do about that? The production of energy is one high generator. Agriculture, interestingly, a very, very big generator, and largely ignored, and with tremendous potential for change. So if we just looked at that as elements, we have to produce energy more cleanly, and we have to produce more energy than we're consuming at the moment if we want to address the needs of those 25% of humanity who don't have the ability to press a switch and get lights and projections. At the same time, agriculture, and I'll come back to that later, but probably of more immediate concern to those of us in this space here, the implication of buildings, connections, infrastructure. And looking at one example, and I'll come to this as a city typology, but if you take the car-hungry, consuming Western United States, California, then this image on the left is very typical of what you would find when I had my first meeting with Steve Jobs about his project, and this was the 1st of September 2009. And in that conversation, he harked back to his youth, his childhood, and the fact that this area was the fruit bowl of the United States, and a demonstration of extraordinary rate of change in terms of technology, because this is now the generator of wealth, the Silicon Valley that we all take for granted. So how could one weave some of these themes in terms of reducing pollution, working with nature, bringing back nature? If we look at his site, and it's on a kind of typical highway that I showed before, then it's a lot of buildings with a lot of asphalt, a lot of car parks, excuse me, no landscaping, and making a big leap into where we are now over that period of some 8 years. And this is the end result. And the first thing that you see is there's a lot of green. It's really going back to the fruit bowl of Steve Jobs' youth. And I'm just going to touch ever so briefly on the larger building, and what you may see is the smaller circular building, which is just below here, the big building, which is the kind of launch pad which was the venue for the product launch a few weeks ago. So if we look at the big circular building and we see these eyebrows, if we look into the junction between those big sheets of curved glass and the kind of eyebrows that come out that deflect the landscape deep into the building, shade it on some elevations, then we start to see the way in which this building breathes. It's really working with the climate, And for some 80% of the year, you don't have to cool or heat the air. Of course, you have the capability of doing that in the extreme. So this building is a fresher, more healthier building. It's consuming less energy. And at the same time, the scale of the greenery, remember that the building harvests its own energy. So it's totally carbon-free and totally self-sufficient. But the greenery is absorbing something like 2,000 tons of carbon dioxide, which is a neighborhood benefit for the area. The launch of the product, the first building that was open to the press, and therefore, by implication, the public, is the circular presentation theatre, the Steve Jobs Theatre. And what is perhaps not apparent from this image is that the large glass fiber, carbon fiber rather, disc of the roof, which is some 47 meters across and weighs 70 tons, is supported entirely on the glass drum. And that is the entry space, and you descend down into the presentation theatre below. So really just giving a glimpse of that. The day before we had this event, I spent 3 hours going around the larger site. And I use this image because post Luis's curating the exhibition, I realized as I was going along this trail, the start of a kind of 5-mile trail that goes through the 170 acres of recreated parkland, planting something like 10,000 trees, that in the 1970s, an unbuilt project was almost like a mini Apple campus. It was a forest outside of Oslo in Vestby. It was for the first client of the fledgling practice, a shipping line called the Fred Olsen line, led by an individual called Fred Olsen, who'd inherited it from his father. And on the occasion of my 80th birthday, Elena had organized for a number of people to come from around the world, and there was Fred Olsen. He said, sitting next to me over this lunch, my only regret is I never built that project at Vestby. And here you can see it's a series of pavilions in the forest with the trails, cross-country ski trails, cycling, hiking, the cars kept on the edges of this naturally wooded site. But really an Apple campus in embryo. But as I delved deeper into it from the drawings of the past, I realized that this was in the 70s, before anybody had invented the term of green architecture. This was about recycling, it was about natural light, and it was about a breathing building and bringing the air from below, from the cool forest floor. And it suddenly clicked that that was the clue to the reinvention of the airport at Stansted. And if you just look at these two kind of cross-section sketches, I realized that it was the same engineer who was an integral part of the design team who'd come up with this idea that you could service from below. And it started with this project in the forest in Norway, and informed how you would, as it were, reinvent. This was the airport terminal at Heathrow, and typical of any terminal in the early 1990s. The roof is just absolutely solid, jam-packed with mechanical equipment. And here you get working together with an engineer to kind of zap the engineering, to get it out of the way. And literally, if you turn this diagram upside down and you put all that heavy servicing on the ground, first of all, it's more economic to put heavy stuff on the ground rather than up in the air on a roof. And secondly, For an operation which is every day of the year, 24 hours, you need to be able to maintain it without stopping the action on the roof or underneath. And in the process, you bring more joy, more spiritual uplift, and you're using less energy. You're working with nature. So that was a kind of revolutionary move at Stansted, and in effect reinvented the terminal as we know it. But you can only, I find, as an architect, you can only make those revolutionary moves quite rarely. They occur at points, and then you spend a large amount of time refining that model, which is a kind of evolutionary process. So Hong Kong Airport could not have happened without Stansted. It's a development of that model, and then an increase in scale in Beijing. But they're all evolutionary. They're building on that big step that happened way, way back 20 years earlier. And so the next revolutionary move, potentially revolutionary move, we'll see because it's early days, is to move from the kind of 30-meter spans here, roughly in imperial terms, 100 feet, and to make that move to almost double that, and something like 170 meters at the largest span, and that is in the Mexico airport. And here, we've essentially dissolved the horizontal plane of the roof, the vertical plane of the walls, and the elements which reach out to the aircraft, and are using one continuous skin. And the columns really become giant funnels. Here you see the 170-meter big span and the smaller spans as they go out to the aircraft. The whole thing really becomes a further, more than a development. But again, if you see this in the context of the exhibition and the way in which Luis juxtaposes it, then you can see the early signs of this building in projects that were projected way, way back in the 1970s with Buckminster Fuller and others. So a very interesting kind of continuum. I was asked to give an inaugural talk to launch the Harvard University Green Buildings and Cities initiative. And I started off with this image, really making the point that a green architecture is not something you kind of, sprinkle the stuff on as a sort of additive. That it really has to be thought from the most basic first principles. And this is a diagram which I've used on many occasions. And it's really making the point that the big decisions on the shape of a building, the form of the building, that has the maximum impact in terms of sustainability for the lowest investment. And as you move up, although this is changing rapidly, the likelihood when this diagram was done was that photovoltaics would be at the tip there. In other words, they would be costing the most to do the least. But if you got the base decisions right, and on Masdar, that would be learning from an age before we even had power and electricity. In other words, how did a desert tribe create an architecture in an age before power and electricity, just using thermal mass, shading, vegetation, water, to be able to make beautiful, cooler habitations. And if you applied those lessons in an experiment like Masdar, then you could achieve a high-quality environment by a small input of that extra energy at the top. If that's true of a building, it's also even more true of the combination of buildings and infrastructure. In other words, cities. So you could say that simplistically, there are three kinds of cities. And there is a very strong relationship between the form of the city, its dependency on the car, and its density to sustainability in terms of the amount of energy consumed. The equivalent of the gas guzzler, the kind of energy-consuming car, is the sprawl, the car-borne city, which is a relatively new invention and is already being called into question, as I'll show shortly. The ideal model, interestingly, although it's rooted in the past, is the model of Madrid, but it could be London, it could be Boston, and taken to an extreme in terms of high density, Manhattan, where the highest proportion of individuals can walk to work from their dwelling or arrive by public transport. So it's very much about proximity. And if we put those onto a graph to demonstrate statistically the relationship between energy consumption is the vertical line. So when you're at the top of that, you're consuming a huge amount of energy. The bottom line is density, low density, high consumption. Madrid, London, whatever, comfortably in the middle there, high performers, and then New York and Manhattan, but Manhattan could be Hong Kong, it could be the Asian. So really, essentially, those three typologies. Now, you would have thought that if that was the reality, then when you had an opportunity in terms of the current rate of urbanization, that you would learn those lessons of history. That is interesting because those lessons are being learned in one part of the globe and largely ignored in another sector. So if you look at Abu Dhabi in, Dubai in 1991, which is relatively kind of close, then this is Dubai now. It is the Houston model. I mean, this is what it is looking like. So whilst the new urbanizations are going in this direction, what is happening to the rest of the world who've gone in this direction and have learnt those lessons? It's quite interesting. If you take Boston, this freeway was built in 1959. In 1995, it was decided that it wasn't really doing its job. It was ripped up. It gave rise to the Big Dig. The Big Dig has produced a neighborhood where crime is lower and real estate values are higher and the quality of urban life is significantly improved. If you go to Asia and you look at Seoul, they buried a river in 1956 in concrete. And then in 2014, they took it all away and brought back the river. And even here in Madrid, in 1960, a road is built next to it. Now it's a pedestrian experience. So in a way, there's a huge gap here and a need to feed those lessons from one part of society to another emerging part of society. Interestingly, this is happening at a point in time with the transportation revolution, whether that is Uber, whether it's the automated car. And what does the automated car do when it effectively has the potential to produce a train, where the car can be nose to tail with the next car, and it can be a flowing line? And to what extent does that, some of the assertions that I made about suburbia. So it has the power to totally transform mobility as we know it. And already the drone, which is a fact of life in terms of recreation, photography, we've all been able to follow the progress of Apple on site by drone fanatics who just fly over and kind of capture it. But when those become passenger-carrying drones, and you look at some of the Airbus explorations, where you could have horizontal and vertical mobility. So really the challenge is, in terms of doing more for less and performance. What are the lessons from this that need to be fed into the wider picture of societies? And coming back to that point about power and electricity, then as a reminder, 1/4 of the planet's population doesn't have access to that power. What are the lessons that we might learn from the world of communications in terms of addressing the issues? This is in Rio, and literally one side of that wall is the equivalent of here. The other side of that wall, the next image, is not in that favela itself, but it could be, is of this extraordinary ad hoc plugging into power transmission. And in a way, already, perhaps that concept of transmission is already into question, the idea that we have to move energy by cables. We've been able to demonstrate in the Mazda experiment that the solar field below of 10 megawatts can power a very energy-intensive university exploring renewable energy 24 hours, 7 days a week above, without any mains transmission. And perhaps by miniaturizing, by, as it were, snipping pieces of that very, very large solar field, distributing them locally through rural communities, you could provide the quality of life that the city offers in rural areas to reduce that flow to the cities and to get a more balanced approach, as well as improving the quality of life. And that, as a potential, it is interesting to see that the whole world of solar, which had up till recently been dismissed by researchers, analysts, that against all expectations, the price of solar and the performance of solar is diminishing rapidly compared with fossil fuels. And in a way, you cannot separate the issue of solar and the problems that it poses, because when you most want that energy, the sun isn't shining, most likely. So that is related to investment in battery production, increasing the performance of batteries. And again, it's common knowledge that the biggest investment is Elon Musk, Tesla in Nevada, the image on the left. But by comparison, you can see that the big investor is China. That's where all the effort, the research is going into a greener future. And in terms of debtors and creditors, this kind of map here, the simple explanation is that all the areas which are red, I'm not so sure what I can do, but maybe if I talk more quietly. The areas that are red are consuming more energy and stuff that they can produce. The green areas are consuming less and therefore can subsidize the red areas. What happens when it all goes red? That's an interesting question. The answer is that somehow, in terms of efficiency versus consumption, we have to do more with less. And what are the lessons from other fields? That idea that maybe we don't have to have heavy transmission lines. Maybe we can work locally in terms of harvesting energy instead of the mega plants which distribute it. And if we look at the Great Atlantic Cable from the 19th century, which weighed billions of grams, and we fast forward to 1947, and we can see that you have all the capability in the boot, the trunk of a car, and then the Nokia talisman of looking at the date, it's 1984. And I remember being one of the first people in London to have a mobile phone. And I remember carrying it proudly into meetings and putting it on the table and kind of, you know, wow. And now this, you know, the handheld thing that's probably in my pocket does more than a room full of this stuff, you know, not that long ago within living memory. So the hope is that if those lessons are fed back into some of the issues in the world that I've described, really seeking to do more with less, using ingenuity. And I find it tremendously kind of encouraging that, that maybe in an ideal world where you really have developed an infrastructure of transport, the Metro Bilbao can really go underground. But for some communities, they will never have that luxury, certainly not in an emerging phase of development. And to do this is at least 30 times more expensive than just building a highway. But Bogota, with an incredible mayor, political leadership, which I'll end on, who also had a background as an architect, decided that if you combined the bus, the highway, and the lessons of mass transit, so you could issue tickets earlier, you could give dedicated lines, you could redesign the concept of the relationship between a platform, a bus shelter, and the movement onto the buses. And in that way, that initiative reduced traffic fatalities in a measurable period by 93%, 40% drop in air pollution, 32% shorter commuting times, overwhelming acceptance, and moving something like, you know, nearly 2.5 million people a day. And again, when I saw this morning, I thought of another initiative, and that was in another part of South America, the idea that you could use ski technology, gondolas, cables, to move people from a favela to an urban center. And that's in Rio de Janeiro, the image on the right. And the sketch on the left was a proposal from another kind of pioneering unbuilt development, which was suggesting a whole range of ideas for an island as a master plan, again for Fred Olsen, whose liners would go from London to the Canary Islands. They would take tourist passengers, they would take goods out, and they'd bring bananas and fruit back together with the tourists. And his desire to preserve the beauty of Gomera, but to open it up to a different kind of tourist trade. So I find a very, very interesting link. To try and sum up, we have to move as communities, and there's a very interesting book, so interesting that I organize for every individual in the practice to have a copy. It's called A Climate of Hope, and it's by a friend who started as a client, Mike Bloomberg, and he, with Carl Pope, head of the Sierra Club, did this book. And the thesis of the book is that really we cannot wait for governments. They take too long. We have to move as cities, civic leaders, and citizens, individuals. And the move has to be from a linear economy, whether that is a national economy or whether it's a city economy. We have to move away from the idea that we bring stuff in, we consume it, and then we just spew it out as waste. We have to move to something which is much more circular. We have to look at the relationship between waste and energy, the idea that you can burn the waste to produce energy, and the whole question of agriculture. If you think about it, that traffic revolution, the move to electric cars, which is already a fact, it's in legislation in India, in London, in countries, the end of the internal combustion engine in terms of cars will linger, it may transform. Once you do that, you take away the byproduct, which are fertilizers. So why, in that scenario, would you ever think about agriculture being out there in the middle of nowhere? Because there's no fertilizer any longer, And you have to move all the water out there, which is going to be a very, very precious commodity indeed. When in the city, what do you have? You have all the waste, which is fertilizer, and the water that goes with it. So you could imagine, I mean, here we're seeing hydroponics. It's a vertical farm. It's an urban farm. And hydroponics, you can, for the same area, get 13 times the yield, and you're consuming less than 1/10 of the water needed. So you're conserving water. So I think there are some very, very exciting developments. In that sense, we called it The Future is Now. You can see already those symptoms. And here, again, by Architects BIG, the idea that a waste-to-energy plant becomes a ski slope. So looking holistically at the relationship between activities. So finally saying cities can change the world for good, and that small changes can make huge differences, and that the answer has to be design and technology. If technology got us into some of the messes that we've been in the past, it's technology that's going to get us out of it. I mean, it's interesting, at the end of the 19th century, London and New York were going under in horse manure. It was horse-drawn traffic. All the traffic jams were horse-drawn. You had the equivalent of the two-seater cab, the hansom cab. You had the equivalent of the trucks, the buses. They were all horse-drawn. And the two cities were literally going under in waste. And within a decade, the cities were clean. Still traffic jams, but the savior were Henry Ford and Benz, the motor car. So the motor car, which is now questioned in many ways as the enemy, was the savior at the end of the 19th century. So it is this idea of diverse skills acting together. No one profession can really solve some of these issues, and that's very much what the foundation is about multidisciplinary working. And it comes back to the political domain, the civic leadership, the idea of communities, civic leaders, progressive change. So cities are the future now. Thank you very much.
Entre Norman Foster y Luis Fernández-Galiano.
Norman, a great pleasure and a privilege. Thank you again for your presentation. Now we are going to have something more intimate, because we are going to discuss the exhibition in Telefónica, and it's not going to be a conversation proper. It's simply, I'm going to stimulate Norman to make some remarks about his own work. Following this exhibition in Telefónica, which is called Common Futures, because it's not only the future, but the future that we all share. And the exhibition is organized, you can already see it there. I think we can ask for the lights again to go down. Can we? Can we take the lights out so the screen is seen? Podemos quitar. Gracias.
Of course.
La exposición está ya en Telefónica, en fin, está abierta siempre, podéis visitarla, espero que pronto. Y la organización, and the organization of the exhibition, which I remark, is simply a main nave and 12 chapels. And each of these chapels explores a version of the future, with one project of Norman, which is very recent, and another which comes from his, sometimes even from his years as a student. The first of the chapels, and this is where he starts discussing, joins drawings made by him as a student of vernacular architecture in 1958, and one of his latest projects, the winery of Chateau Margaux near Bordeaux. And somehow 60 years of difference and a conducting thread from this, this exploration of vernacular architecture, and this which is perhaps the more organic of your recent projects. So I'm just going to go through these 12 dialogues and ask for Norman to make some remarks. So the first one, here you are.
Well, I, as a student, would perhaps protest some of the rituals that at a very traditional school like Manchester that I had to go through. And one was doing the measured drawing in the summer. And the challenge was that you had to take a building, you had to crawl all over it, measure it, make notes, and then when you'd done that, you then went back home. I mean, this was a trip to Cambridge to measure a barn. The first thing that was different is that nobody had ever chosen an anonymous building. In the past, everybody had chosen Georgian buildings. This was not considered architecture. So already I was kind of out of step as a student, because for me, this was really interesting architecture. It didn't mean to say that I did not appreciate Georgian high architecture. Of course I did, cathedrals. But it seemed to me there was a whole range of buildings. Then the act of having to then go away, and that's it. You only got one shot, unless you were rich enough to be able to go back and measure something that you'd forgotten, which in my case I couldn't. So you then had to construct measured drawings. I elected to do them again, first time ever, three-dimensionally. Normally they were just done as plan sections and elevations. And so
this is how it's shown in the exhibition.
Yes, this is how it's shown in the exhibition. So in a way, Margaux, when given the challenge of adding a new building, everybody expected that would be an opportunity for a great celebration of some amazing modern new building that would contrast with the agricultural buildings. I want you to imagine Chateau Margaux. It's an 1815 chateau. It's the jewel. The kind of long avenue of trees leads up to it. All to one side are fairly noble, anonymous, big roof, tiled buildings. And I made the decision that really the protagonist was the 1815 Palladian-inspired villa. And that this was an opportunity. I suddenly saw it as an opportunity to do something that was totally contemporary. It was a big roof. I found going round the estate a number of ruined buildings where you could take the tiles and create another roof. And underneath that would be a very, very elegant steel structure. And then you could change everything under that roof in the future. And of course, this as a tree is evocative of the trees in nature. The nicest story, and for me the ultimate compliment, was told to me by the late manager of the estate. And he said, I came across a total stranger wandering around the estate and asked him what he was doing. And he said, I heard that there was a new building, but I can't find it. So anyway.
So this was the future of the past, and how vernacular architecture could fertilize contemporary works. Now we go to the future of culture, and then we compare a work of yours in near Nîmes, sorry, Nîmes.
Nîmes,
in front of the Maison Carrée, and of course the project for the Prado Museum.
Yes, and the little project in Nîmes, which is next to the oldest surviving Roman temple, beautifully preserved Roman temple, is very much about engaging with the city. So it takes the classical traditional device in steel, but of a portico, which really is reaching out to this tiny city and breaking down the barrier between the infrastructure, the public spaces of the city, and the more private inner spaces within the building itself. And that is taken to a further degree in the proposal for the Prado. And the team behind that is here today, and will recall the struggles that we had. And in the end, we said, let's present one scheme, but with two variations. And one embraces much more the city. So again, those themes over time, coming out looking, incidentally, completely different, as you'd expect. But the principle is the same.
Now, so the third dialogue, again, between the very recent completion of the Bloomberg headquarters in London, Bloomberg that you have mentioned as the author of the book that we all must read, and of course a building from the first part of your career.
Yes, well, in a way, the Willis Faber and Dumas building, again, was against all the expectations. It was an office building, so everybody expected that on that site we'd do a tower. And against everybody's expectations, what elected to do was to follow the geometry of the street, albeit with a suspended glass wall, which was absolutely revolutionary at the time, but to recreate the streets and create a building that was low. And so you would come across it more by surprise, coming through a street, seeing a glimpse of a building. And then you'd have big floors, and you would rise up between those floors in natural light through escalators. It would have a green roof, so it's very much about lifestyle. There was no swimming pool at that time, so it had a swimming pool, again, unique in terms of creating an office building. And Bloomberg builds on that. Willis Faber was an energy efficient building in its day. Today it wouldn't be, it would still be a high performer, but this is a much higher performer because it's a natural breathing building. The principles I was talking about on Apple, but much, much more difficult to achieve on a congested urban site with a lot of exhaust fumes, pollution, noise. So the facade are the kind of gills like a fish. That enables the building to breathe. That's normal in a very shallow building, but to do a deep building and to pull air through and to have a healthier environment as a consequence, aside from the implications in terms of energy, that is, again, it's a progression, it's a development. That would have not have been possible, incidentally, to do at the time of Willis Faber. I think the ability to compute a model and to be able to predict, although we have done to enable this building to be built, we built a huge portion of it in a warehouse as a test facility and monitored it in real time, as it were.
And then a dialogue about flexibility and how buildings can join.
Yes, the building on the right in Buenos Aires is the then mayor, who's the president now, Mauricio Macri, to regenerate the city, proposed different zones. And the zone where this building was designated as a technology zone. And by a number of devices, that being one of them, the other being the insertion of a higher quality of public transport. When we started this project on site, it was a no-go area. Visiting it on a site visit, we were advised not to get out of the car. Now, it is totally transformed. So that political policy, together with the insertion of a key building, and the competition was for a bank headquarters. And in between the start on site and the finish of construction, the administration did a deal with the bank, and it is now the town hall. So as Luis says, it's amongst other things, an example of flexibility, the ability to be able to recycle a building for a completely different use. And the Sainsbury Center, again, was about breaking down barriers, breaking down the barriers between the public who would come to see a permanent collection and the School of Fine Art that would teach the history, the appreciation of fine art. And so all under one roof instead of several different buildings, which was initially expected. So the ability under a roof to have different activities and to be able to interchange those.
Now, a dialogue between something you did, now you should change it, because now you have suggested a better dialogue for Apple than the original commission of Olsen,
well,
which is a second commission by the same client.
Yes, I mean, here we could modify the exhibition to take into account the changes which arose in my talk. Olsen is still valid next to Apple because in a short time it's difficult to explain Olsen, but it was about bringing together the workers, the dockers, and management, and demonstrating that they could come together under one roof. And that was in the 1960s, against the kind of cultural climate. So it was a tremendous achievement. It was only achieved, I think, by my being able to wear 3 hats. The first was that I was elected as the representative of the unions to liaise with management. I was elected by Olsen's to represent Olsen's in negotiations with the unions. And incidentally, by the way, I was also the architect with my colleagues of the building. But the building only happened because I was able to perform those other roles. And the common thread between that and Apple is that it tried to demonstrate that it was about a lifestyle. So the dockers not only had, for the first time, decent showers, decent food, decent cafeteria, they also had games. They had table tennis, they had billiards, darts. So it was very much about lifestyle. In the same building, the office workers were on carpet. This was unheard of. Nobody had ever been in an office with carpet before. There were works of art on the wall from Fred's collection in Oslo. So it was about lifestyle, and of course, that's the 60s, and that was unheard of. I mean, it still would be quite radical, I think, even today. So Apple, in turn, it's about lifestyle. It's about, you know, more than just the 9-to-5 activities.
And then, after the future of work, the future of welfare, the future of
Well, I think, Luis, when we started to explore what we're doing now and what had been done in you know, long in the past, we found buildings of the same scale, which were kind of pro bono exercises. This was for a charity on the left, in the way that the more recent building on the right for Maggie's, a kind of cancer care center. But they're both about caring, they're both about an intimate, domestic, reassuring kind of architecture, which is essentially homely.
And of course you have...
I've really already talked about this. I mean, this was a kind of visionary idea which we call climate office, the idea that you, at some point in the future, would be able to create very, very large enclosures. Now, of course, Bucky at this time in the 70s had already demonstrated that, but and I remember doing a sketch of Willis Faber with that very, very amorphous shape. And I still have that sketch in a sketchbook in the foundation, and it says, one day we may be able to do this, but we don't have the technology or the knowledge now. And I say something like, maybe in the future. And interestingly, fast forwarding to now, we do, through computing, calculating abilities, we can, under construction, be able to create those very, very large shells. Of course, there are countless individuals behind that. A work of Fray Otto, extraordinary Spanish engineers, Gustavino, Volts, and so on. So it's a long and interesting and very distinguished history.
So after the future of construction, the future of technology, in which we have shown again another work that we did with Buckminster Fuller, and the first project of the foundation.
Yes, yes, the drone port.
The drone port.
Which again was, had certain common denominators with the lunar projects. In the idea of the drone port, which are remote communities on a continent which doesn't have a good infrastructure of transport, doesn't even have decent roads. The idea that you could use drones, new technology, to transport urgent medical supplies swiftly and economically over long distances and kind of leapfrog the railways and the roads which are still to come, and create a building typology that would enable local communities to work with the raw materials around them with a small additive. So using the local soil. And that same principle in terms of the lunar habitations. The idea that it's very, very expensive to transport stuff into outer space. So essentially you're taking a robot and you're using the Earth, the regolith, the moon dust, which is all around you, and with an additive and a robot. So one is deliberately labor intensive here, and the other is robotic, because really you want to create the dwelling and then get out and use the dwelling. So some interesting common denominators.
Yes. And now the future of mobility, with an example you have already mentioned in your presentation, which is the Bilbao Metro with the Foster.
And yes, which was conceived really around using the space above railway lines, arguably applicable to many, many cities around the world. And interesting, the railway line always chooses the line of least resistance. It can't go up steep hills or downhill, so it's essentially flat. And really that's already been overtaken by events, because it's too good an idea just for cyclists. If you think about the High Line, it could be a linear park, it could be about soft vehicles, delivery, as well as bicycles.
And the future of sustainability with this plan of La Gomera, also with your client Fred Olsen, from the 60s and from 1965, and then Masdar.
Gomera yes, and Masdar. I've talked about the links between that.
That you have discussed.
Gomera was interesting in the learning from the past. As a kind of mountain in the middle of the island, you'd have the prevailing winds that would build up clouds, and it would precipitation, rainfall on one side, pitch roofs, the other side sunny. So even on an island, two kinds of architecture responding to the microclimate.
So which is a pioneering sustainability study, yes, that is of course echoed in
sure,
Masdar, that you have already discussed before. And then the future of networks and communications, with another Spanish example, the Collserola Tower in Barcelona, built for the 1992 Olympics, and your sadly not built
yes,
airport and infrastructure in the history of the Thames River.
Yes, I mean it's easy to forget that the Collserola Tower again came out of a political act of courage. Pascal Maragall, the mayor, who mounted a campaign culminating in a competition for a tower. But what this image doesn't tell you is that what was there before were towers everywhere, and the prospect of even more towers, everybody having their own little tower. And so it was an act of tremendous political courage for this mayor to say, what we're going to do, take all those little towers down, get rid of them, they're an eyesore. We're going to have one tower for everybody. And that sounds very easy, but in a real life situation where you've got one monopoly wanting their tower and another, and to say, you're going to have to inhabit the same tower, sorry. I think there are political parallels which are perhaps...
In a very visionary proposal that sadly was not accepted by, by the government of London.
Well, my own prediction is that the idea that a capital city like London is overflown daily, nightly by traffic, and that it's got nowhere to go. It's a very current British tradition of kind of make, do and mend. I think it's absolutely inevitable. Probably won't happen in my lifetime, but at some point in the future, I guarantee that some version of this will happen. I think it's absolutely inevitable.
You have already built an airport on sea?
Yes,
in Hong Kong.
Yes.
But in London it was fairly...
No big deal to knock down a mountain and make a big site, connect it with a railway.
Yeah, and finally, the last chapel of the exhibition is the future of the future, taking your first project and one of the last.
Yes, all the affinities and the kind of links that we talked about together in the last hour or so. So yes, I think the other, when you go to the exhibition, there's probably one thing that you'll see and you'll take for granted. I think one kind of brilliant move of Louis was to use the structure of the 1929 building, done by an American engineer, I believe, with Spanish architects, and to use that structure as it marches through the space to, in a way, be a kind of framework and to reveal that. So I think it's a celebration of the building itself and Telefónica's foundation in it.
Celebration of the building, which ends up with the possibility of colonizing other...
Out there in space.
planets.
All about space.
So okay. Thank you so much, Norman. It's been a great privilege having you here. And I think we will all remember your presence in Madrid, which is not the first, and we hope very much it will not be the last. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.